Oh, yeah, I can see that.
Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks, John.
Hi everyone, my name is Allie and I'm one of the two co-directors of Science in the News. Our brand new co-director Emily is here. And we are a graduate student group that seeks to bridge the communication gap between scientists and the general public. And we do this through a bunch of different events, including the seminar series that you're sitting in right now. If you grab a flyer on your way out, you'll see the rest of the seminar series lectures that we have for the rest of the semester. And we also have our website on here where you can log on and check out all the other events we have, including bringing scientists to a bar to chat with the public more casually. We have a day-long conference in June. We also have a blog where we post a lot of really fun articles that honestly are just fun, and it's a really cool way to learn about something new. Especially if you see something in the news, we try to cover it quickly to give our spin on it. So tonight we have a lecture by one of our volunteers, Emily. She's been with Science in the News for quite some time now, and we have a little handout here that tells us a little bit about our speaker, as well as highlighting some terms that you might hear her saying over and over again throughout the talk. Her talk will be split up into a few different parts, so we ask that you hold your questions until we get to a specified question break, and then we'll have a short intermission halfway through, and then Emily will resume. So with that, I'll let her take it away. Thanks, guys.
So thank you guys for coming. Today I want to talk a little bit about energy and what its place has been in human history and how we might get and use it in the future. So I want to begin with talking a little bit about the past. And to do that, we're going to need to understand what is energy, how do we harness it for our own use, how do we store it as electricity, and how has our use of Earth's energy resources changed over time? So to start with, what is energy? For the purpose of this talk, we're going to consider something as having energy if it can make something move, if it can make something hot, or if it can produce light. And in order to take energy and harness it for our own use, we have to make something else lose energy. This is a zero-sum game. Any energy we use must come from somewhere else. So what kind of things have energy that we could take away? Well, one way we do this is by finding something that is moving fast and slowing it down. So somebody who is running has energy. If they stop, they have lost that energy. And this is the basic principle behind how windmills work. You take fast wind going towards the windmill, and when it comes out, it's moving more slowly. That energy that it has lost has been transferred to the windmill. Another method we use is to push something down a hill. So if you have a ball that's sitting at the top of the hill, it has energy. It can move if you push it. Once it's at the bottom of the hill, it can't move anymore. That energy's been lost. And this is the basic principle that a lot of hydroelectric power uses. You take water that's at the top of a reservoir, you let it flow down, and you capture for yourself the energy that's lost. But perhaps the most common way that humans capture energy is by burning things. So we take plants, either ones that have died recently like wood or ones that have died a longer time ago like fossil fuels, and we burn it to make heat. I mentioned fossil fuels. Fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas are plants that died many millions of years ago. We drill or mine them from the earth, burn them, and when that happens, we produce energy, which is our reason for burning them. We also produce carbon dioxide, which turns out to be a little bit problematic, and we'll discuss why later. And then we also produce water. Now, it's not horribly efficient to have everybody burning their own coal in their backyard for their energy needs, so we usually store energy as electricity. And the way this works is we spin a turbine, and we can spin that turbine with either water, steam, or air. But once it starts moving, we have movement again, so there's energy stored in the spinning of the turbine, which in turn spins a magnet, and that magnet feeds the electricity into the electrical wires that deliver it to our house. So let's take a step back. Before we had electricity, how did humans use energy? And there's a couple big human milestones I want to discuss as part of this talk. Starting all the way back 1.5 million years ago, when humans or human ancestors controlled fire for the first time. We're then going to fast forward to about 10,000 BC, when we domesticated the first plants and animals. Going from there to 3000 BC, when we captured the wind for the first time in the form of sailboats. And then moving into the switch from BC to AD, we're going to see the development of the first water wheels and the first windmills, and how that changed how humans live. And then we're going to move into more modern times, going quickly through the Industrial Revolution in the 17 and early 1800s, into the development of electricity in the 1800s. And in the 1900s, we're going to discuss how it came to be that virtually every person in America can go home, flip a light switch, and expect energy to be harnessed immediately. Let's start at the beginning. Originally, we had only one way to get energy, and that was from going out, searching for food, eating it, and then using the energy our bodies produce from the food to go search for more food, build a cave place, just kind of hang out. So this changed about 1.5 million years ago. Oh, my apologies. At this point, when we're relying totally on our ability to eat food for energy, a human being has about enough energy at his disposal to power one old-fashioned incandescent light bulb. So we would need approximately 20 cavemen to keep all the lights in this room on. Fortunately, humans harness sources of energy external to themselves, starting about 1.5 billion years ago, when we discovered fire. And fire is a really important source of energy because it allowed us to live in many more places than we would otherwise be able to. You can't live in Massachusetts without an external source of heat. Fire provided that. But we didn't stop there. About 10,000 years ago, we domesticated plants and animals. We started with grain, then proceeded to dogs, goats, sheep, cows, and horses. So this has a really dramatic effect. It's hard to have a farm and stay in one place taking care of that farm if you don't have domesticated plants to eat. So now we don't have to spend energy searching for new food. We can just keep it nearby. And as we started to develop animals like cows and horses, we don't have to do the farming ourselves. We can use animal energy to pull our plows for us. And at this point, we can live in cities. We can stay in one place. We're really not cavemen at all anymore. We're starting to look like modern humans. So by 3,000 years ago, we took another step, and this was the development of the sailboat. So we talk a lot about wind energy today, but it's really quite old that we realized we could use the wind to push us different places. And this is significant because now, in addition to being able to live in one place, we can move from those cities and go visit and trade with other places, which is something you can't do if you don't have the wind to push you. So at this point, we have a few different abilities that we didn't have when we first evolved. We can live outside the tropics in colder environments. We can live in one place, develop cities and trades and civilizations. And we can travel and trade across the seas. We're not limited by how far we can walk under our own power. What came next is the development of windmills and water wheels. So these developed both by around 800 AD water wheels developed a little bit sooner than windmills. And what these were used for very often was grinding grain to make bread. So just like our turbines do today, your water wheel will be turned by water. That will allow you to crush the wheat in order to make your bread. Windmills work the same way. The wind turns the rotors and allows you to make your bread. So with all of this, with our windmills, water wheels, and sailboats, our medieval baker is now able to power about 3 light bulbs worth of energy. So in about 1.5 million years, we've tripled the amount of energy we have available to us. And at this point, things start to change really significantly. And what happens first is the Industrial Revolution. So in the 1700s into the early 1800s, we developed the steam engine. And the way the steam engine works is you take coal and you set it on fire. We're starting to use fossil fuels in earnest at this point. And that heats tanks of water. The heated tanks of water eventually boil, and you produce steam that moves pistons up and down. And you use the movement of those pistons to power your trains and your factories. But what you can't do particularly well is provide energy to smaller scale operations like people's homes. And that would come in the late 1800s with electricity. So many of you have probably heard of Edison as well as Tesla. And in the late 1800s, both of them were working on electricity. They were kind of competing to be the first one to commercialize it. And Edison wanted to put what's called direct current electricity into everybody's home. So what that is they produce the electricity at a power plant and it travels in a straight line down a wire to your home. Tesla wanted to use alternating current, which travels back and forth until it eventually reaches your home. And this got really heated in what was called the War of the Currents. So Edison is a savvy businessman. He is trying really, really hard to convince everyone that no, we can't use alternating current, it's unsafe. So he takes animals onto the street and electrocutes them. He convinces governments to use the electric chair as a means of execution. Clearly, if we can kill people with alternating current, you don't want that in your home. But what ultimately ends this is in 1893, Chicago is hosting a World Fair. They want to have a light show at the end of it. They want to power this with this new electricity. So both Edison and Tesla put out bids, and Tesla ends up saying he can provide the electricity for half as much as Edison can. So the fair's like, yeah, we'll pay half as much. And this happens. Tesla powers the World Fair. Alternating current wins the War of the Currents, and that's what we use even onto today. But now that we're going with alternating current, we need to spread throughout the country. So power companies are developed, they start competing to get customers, and we run into a problem. And that problem is it's much cheaper to build one big power plant than to build a bunch of little ones. And it is hard to move electricity a long way from the power plant. So from the perspective of an electrical company, it sounded like a really good idea to build a power plant right outside of New York City or Philadelphia or Boston or another big city. It didn't sound like such a good idea to build it in the middle of a cornfield and supply electricity to local farmers. So if you lived in New York, you might have a situation where there's hundreds of wires overhead. There's 3 different electricity companies trying to sell you their electricity. And if you lived in a rural area, you might not have access to electricity at all. The expansion of electricity largely occurred in the 1930s. And what happened at this point is the Great Depression. So electricity companies are struggling financially because fewer people can afford their product. And the government is building several large hydroelectric dams, including the Hoover Dam, so that they can employ some of the people who have become unemployed in the Great Depression. So the government wants a return on the investment that they're spending building these dams, and they want it to benefit as many people as possible. So they allow electrical companies to sell electricity as a monopoly in an area, but they have to promise that everybody is going to have access to that electricity. And logistically, how that happens is you have a power plant. Traditionally, it's burning coal. Today, maybe it's burning natural gas or it's a nuclear power plant. But it's using the steam or the gas from burning that to spin a turbine, which is producing the electricity. That gets fed into high voltage wires that carry it long distances, and then send it into smaller wires that take it into individual neighborhoods and ultimately into individual homes. And it's this process that takes electricity from power plant to home that we call the electric grid. And all of these inventions, electricity and the Industrial Revolution, means that if you're an average office worker in America today, you have enough energy at your disposal to power 100 light bulbs. So within even the last 200 years or so, we have become vastly more powerful. And we can represent that graphically by showing on the y-axis here the energy in terawatt hours that humanity has had access to. And for those of you who don't live in apartments and pay your own electricity bill, 1 terawatt hour is the same amount of energy as 1 billion kilowatt hours. And since the 1750s, we didn't have much energy. We didn't have much. Around 1900, we're getting electricity, and it very dramatically shoots up, and it is continuing to shoot up today. So I'm going to stop here for questions. Yes.
So I'm amazed at the photo you showed of all of the wires
Yes.
above the city. So they move everything, or well, some underground now, right? And
Yes.
can you comment on like how that transition happened? Did they just think tired of all these wires blocking the sky? Like how did that
So
be?
in this picture, you have a ton of wires. This picture was actually published in 1889 before they just cut a bunch of them down. It's not really economical to have 3 people providing electricity for 1 house. And if you don't have that happening, you don't need as many wires. I don't have a great sense of when we started doing underground wires. I believe part of the motivation for that is it's just more durable. You don't have to worry about something hitting it or falling on it and then knocking out electricity. Okay, so that's how we got to where we are. I want to talk a little bit about what our energy landscape looks like today. And to do this, we're going to have to talk about fossil fuels, why we are choosing to use them, and why we really cannot continue using them as our primary form of energy. We're going to talk about the renewable energy sources that we're using quite a lot of, and that includes hydropower and nuclear power. And we're going to briefly touch upon where wind and solar energy are today. And then we're going to talk about how this electric grid chooses which kind of energy it is going to buy and send to your home. So the grid today looks something like this. If you take a photo of the Earth at night, quite a bit of it is lit up. If you live in North America, in Western Europe, in some of the more populated places, parts of China, you have electricity. There are a few exceptions. You can see sub-Saharan Africa here is pretty dark. So quite a few people still don't have access to electricity. And this graph shows the proportion of people in each geographic region who have electricity access, with dark blue places being virtually 100% and yellow or light blue places being progressively less. So we still have quite a few places, particularly in the Pacific Islands and in Africa, where less than 50% of people have access to electricity. And it works out that that's about 1.3 billion people, or about 1 in every 6 humans, don't have any electricity. And many more, particularly if they live in cities, have electricity, but it's not reliable. And that's irritating if you live in a home. It's potentially very dangerous if you are a hospital or a school or something else that depends on this electricity. The other difficulty with our current electric grid is that we get most of our energy from burning fossil fuels. So if we look at this graph, the y-axis is again the amount of energy we're consuming, and red, gray, blue, and purple are all fossil fuels. Red is biofuels, so that's traditionally been things like wood. Now it's frequently things like ethanol that we make from corn. Gray is coal. Blue is the oil, a lot of which goes to run our cars and trucks. And purple is natural gas. All of those we burn. They do give off the energy. They also give off carbon dioxide. And this is a problem for two reasons. The first is that burning fossil fuels in general creates quite a bit of pollution. So this is a photo of a smoggy day in Southeast Asia. Smog like this does cause quite a few health problems, particularly in children, particularly in the respiratory tract. The other problem is even when there is no pollution, you're still releasing carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide acts as a blanket covering the Earth's surface. Light from the sun is able to get through it okay, but it gets trapped on its way back out, and that causes gradual warming of the Earth's surface, which causes more extreme and unpredictable weather patterns, as well as rising sea levels and increased flooding. So burning fossil fuels causes these problems, but not all fossil fuels are created equal. So we've discussed three different kinds of fossil fuels kind of in passing: coal, oil, and natural gas. Coal is a solid, you mine it from the ground. Oil is a liquid, and natural gas is, as you may guess from the name, gas. These two we drill. And for the same amount of energy, to get the same amount of energy, you need to burn 1,000 pounds of carbon dioxide, but you will produce 1,000 pounds of carbon dioxide if you are burning coal, 764 pounds if you are burning oil, and only 577 pounds if you're burning natural gas. So if your goal is to avoid producing carbon dioxide that contributes to climate change, you are better off burning natural gas, although it does not solve your problem. So what kind of resources do we have available to us that we can create energy with, but not create carbon dioxide? And there's really two big ones and some emerging little ones. So on this graph, I've taken out all of the fossil fuels and left only the renewable energy sources. And in purple, we have nuclear power. You can see that nuclear power kind of reached 40% of our renewable resources around the 1980s, early 1990s, and has fallen off a little bit. In blue, we have hydropower, which makes up a big chunk of the energy we get from renewable sources. And in this teeny strip of yellow that is just starting to get bigger, we have solar and wind energy. So let's talk a little bit about the two big ones first, hydroelectric and nuclear power. The way hydropower works is you build a dam so that you have a very tall reservoir of water stuck behind the dam. And when you want energy out of it, you can allow some of the water to flow downwards. So it's going from a high altitude to a low altitude and losing energy. That energy can be used to spin the turbine, which produces the electricity, and then the water ends up in the river below your dam. And a major example of this is the Three Gorges Dam in China. So this is the biggest hydroelectric power plant in the world. It produces 22,500 megawatts of power on average. That's enough to power about 160 Boeing 747 jets. And compared to what China would otherwise be burning to produce energy, which is principally coal, you avoid 200 million tons of carbon dioxide being emitted into the atmosphere every year, which is about the weight of 550 Empire State Buildings. The downside of this is you do have to flood an area to create the reservoir for that dam. And in order to do this, you had to relocate 1.24 million people. And that's about the population of Rhode Island. It's a little bit bigger. And this meant that 13 cities 140 towns and 1,350 villages were flooded. The archaeological resources that were in that area have been lost, and some biodiversity was lost to provide this power. So to kind of sum up hydropower, it is renewable. There is no carbon dioxide produced. We're not causing climate change. It's pretty much always available. If you plan your reservoir well, you are not going to run out of water. And it's renewable. The water is going to be there. The disadvantages is you do have to create this reservoir. So you are going to displace the people and animals who live where that is going to be. And you're also going to have to flood an area where plants live. And that's going to kill the land plants, and they are going to release methane. And methane, much like carbon dioxide, traps heat inside the Earth's surface and contributes to global warming. So the other form of energy that we've invested heavily in is nuclear power. And the basic principle of nuclear power is there is a massive amount of energy stored within a nucleus. So we can stored within a nucleus of an atom. So we can break that nucleus into multiple parts and then take the energy that's given off for ourselves. And the main atom we use to produce nuclear energy is uranium. There's two different kinds of uranium primarily. There's uranium-235, which is very useful for nuclear power. And there's uranium-234, which naturally makes up 99% of what actually exists. So how can we take these two types of uranium and get to an amount of uranium-235 that is useful to power a nuclear reactor? Well, we start by mining it. So you dig a uranium mine, you dig up a whole bunch of uranium ore, and then you purify it. You remove anything that's not uranium, which is in itself kind of an energy-intensive and messy process. The uranium ore has a bunch of uranium atoms, and they're hanging out with oxygen atoms. To make nuclear fuel, we want to replace those oxygens with the atom fluoride. So we can do that chemically. That's not too bad of a process. The tricky part comes from separating that uranium-235 from the uranium-234. And to do that, we rely on the fact that uranium-235, I apologize, there's a typo there, is very slightly heavier than uranium-234. So if you spin it really fast, the uranium-235 is going to end up falling relative to the uranium-234. And then you can take it off the bottom and compress it into fuel pellets like these, which you stack up into fuel rods, which you can put into your nuclear reactor to produce your energy. What you have to consider once you're done producing your energy is what you are going to do with the waste. Nuclear waste remains more radioactive than what you originally took out of the uranium mine for about 10,000 years. So you have to find a way to keep humans away from it for that period of time. So what nuclear power plants do first is they take these fuel rods out of their nuclear reactor and they put it in a giant tank of water. And what this does is it gives it a few months or a few years to cool down. Once it's at a reasonable temperature, you can move it to a concrete tank. It's not going to be dangerous to human health in the concrete tank as long as there's no kind of emergency or sabotage situation. And after that, we haven't totally decided what to do with it yet. Right now, all of our nuclear waste is mostly safe in tanks. You can bury it, often under a mountain or another geological landmark. The other thing to consider with nuclear power is accidents very, very rarely happen, but when they do happen, it's a very bad day. And the worst example of this is the Chernobyl disaster that happened in April 1986. They had some inexperienced technicians who were running an experiment and decided they should cut down the power regulatory systems and the safety systems. To make things worse, the power plant was on the older side and didn't have many of the safety systems that current power plants do. So the nuclear reactions that were occurring for the purpose of producing energy started occurring too quickly. There was a pressure build up, and the top ended up flying off the power plant. There was some graphite in the nuclear reactor that was supposed to be preventing this from happening. When the top flew off, it caught fire, which caused about 5% of the nuclear fuel to be released into the atmosphere. Much of that nuclear fuel had dangerous levels of radioactivity, so this was a threat to animal and human well-being. The Soviet Union evacuated the area. There were a number of immediate deaths just from the explosion. And then in the area around the power plant, you saw an increase in radiation illnesses, including thyroid cancers and thyroid diseases. What this has resulted in is there are more safety regulations before you are allowed to build a nuclear power plant. That means they are very expensive and take a very long time to get built. And the other thing to consider with nuclear power is there's only a finite number of uranium atoms in the world. So at the current rate that we're producing nuclear power, we could keep going for about 80 more years before we ran out of uranium that we know how to mine. There is more uranium on the planet. Some of it's buried deep underground, and we're not sure how to get it out in a kind of cost-effective manner. There is a ton of it in the Earth's oceans, but it is very, very dilute, so it's not clear how we might separate that from everything else that is in the ocean. People have proposed, although never really found an economical method of developing a breeder reaction. So in that case, you put one atom that you can split in, and you take two atoms that could be split to produce energy out. Another thing that's been considered is a closed fuel cycle. So you take that waste from your uranium reactor and you put it in a new reactor. There's a couple concerns with this. One of them is cost. It's a relatively expensive way to continue producing nuclear power. The other one is security. Part of the reason nuclear reactors are generally fairly safe from terrorism is that it's really hard to separate that uranium-234 from uranium-235, and governments are very secretive about how they do that. If you take the waste products, those aren't quite as difficult to separate anymore. So you have to make sure they don't fall into the wrong hands. So to summarize nuclear power, there is no carbon dioxide production. We are avoiding the climate change situation. The energy is pretty much always available. As long as you have fuel rods, you can keep your nuclear reactor running. And once you get it built, it's fairly cheap to keep it running because there is a massive, massive amount of energy stored in each atom. The disadvantages is that actually enriching the uranium is a complicated and messy process. You have to be careful about your security. It's slow to get new power plants online. And part of that is because if there is an accident, it's very bad. So let's talk about the third source of renewable energy that is not hydroelectric or nuclear power. And the two big players in that chunk are solar and wind. And you might have recalled from the beginning of this section that solar and wind provide very small amounts of our renewable energy. But if we look at them by themselves, we can see the amount of electricity they're producing is growing very, very rapidly. So wind around 20 years ago started to shoot up. Solar has done so even in the past 10 years, since about 2008 or so. And we can expect those to continue growing into the future. And we're going to talk about that a little bit in the next section. So how does the grid decide which of these forms of energy is going to go into the electrical wires and ultimately to your home? What happens is every hour or so, power producers can say, we will sell the energy we are producing for this much. The lowest bids get to provide that energy, and this helps keep costs to the consumers low. When there are a lot of people using electricity, it costs more. So at around 6 p.m. in the afternoon, people are coming home, they're turning on their dishwashers and their ovens and their lights. Electricity will cost more than it does at 3 a.m. when nobody's using any. And the plants with the lowest bids, whether they are nuclear, whether they are fossil fuel, whether it is a wind or solar farm, will start producing the energy. They will send it into the wires that will provide it to individual consumers. Any questions so far? Yeah.
We're speaking, I believe, about something called closed cell cycles.
Yes.
Can you explain that a little bit?
Sure. So the idea behind a closed fuel cycle is that you finished running your nuclear reactor, you split your original atoms into new types of atoms. What we do now is we just stick that in a tank and hopefully never think about it again. And that's called an open fuel cycle. That's just a waste product. A closed fuel cycle would remediate that waste product so it could be used again in a new nuclear reactor. That's still a little bit expensive for technical reasons. The security concern is that right now, as a waste product, it's dangerously radioactive. If you tried to steal some, you would be dead in a couple of minutes, and that would make it difficult to continue stealing it. In order to remediate it for a nuclear reactor, it becomes much easier to steal, and you're having to transport it different places, so that, again, makes it a little bit of a security risk.
Is the main constraint thought to be cost, or is it security, or kind of a mix of both?
I think it's kind of a mix of both. I think very frequently with energy technology, the people thinking about security are the government and people interested in security from that perspective, and the people thinking about cost are the actual potential electric producers. As long as cost is still a barrier, people who want to use this system are not going to start pushing the security question. And we do still have a reasonable amount of uranium left. 80 years is not as long as we have fossil fuel resources left, but it is 8 decades. So they'll continue using that while it's still available.
Okay, I think.
Yeah. Oh, I think there was a question behind you.
I think that should be plutonium.
Which one?
Polonium in the bottom.
Oh, yeah.
So
Sorry
that
about that.
should be plutonium.
Thanks for pointing that out.
So let's take a short intermission, about 5 minutes. And I want to also remind you guys that we have these cards outside for feedback and also to get suggestions from you on what you want to hear for future lectures. So if you have an idea, jot it down and also get it into the next series. So feedback here in 5 minutes. Thanks.
So,
people talk about security.
Yeah.
But has anybody ever died in electricity that we know of?
So Chernobyl is the big one. There's been, I guess, 3 major nuclear reactions. There's been 3 Mile Island, at which nobody died, and it's not even clear that anybody eventually got cancer down the line. It's hidden in the noise and statistics. At Chernobyl, about 4 to 6 people died in the actual explosion.
Right.
Then I think there's only over 4 dozen excess cancer cases. And then at Fukushima, which was that explosion in Japan in 2012, there were again a handful of people who died in the immediate
Which
explosions.
is considering any industry.
Yes. Yeah, nuclear definitely.
Really,
Yes.
is it just the fear or is it really unsafe? That is the question. Is it the emotional fear or is it really unsafe or is it more other issues?
Yeah.
I just wondering.
So our best estimate is per amount of energy produced, far fewer people die from nuclear than certainly from things like coal and oil, where you have accidents fairly routinely, but even things like wind, where
Wind, solar,
sometimes
because
eventually
you
someone,
produce, you have,
eventually someone's going to fall down and small them. I
in the
think,
manufacturing plant, you have
yeah,
whatever.
I think nuclear inspires fear to a certain extent because you're not going to die in a coal accident if you're not a coal miner. So people feel better not thinking about it.
Which is not true. We know that, right?
Yes.
Considering that we, what coal produce, and not even counting climate
Yeah.
change and
That's the
considering
other thing.
the smog and all those kind of things. There are a lot
Yeah,
more
that's
than
the other things. The statistics that count deaths per amount of energy almost never count deaths for pollution. So people have a fatal asthma attack because they've been exposed to coal pollutants. Their lives count, but not in those statistics.
that is actually a little bit my question is there any way to have a fully costed kind of production, right?
A fully,
Fully cost, the full cost, because the cost
Yeah.
is there are a lot of downstream costs because
yes.
nuclear, we don't know the cost yet because
Yeah.
we don't know how to dispose of the waste yet.
Right.
So we cannot assume that just right now we keep those things on some barrel on the plant
Yeah.
and can we say, oh, that is the cost of 50 people watching this for 5,000 years, right?
Yeah.
So,
So
but
certainly, like for fossil fuels, trying to impose like a tax on the social costs of what you're doing has not been a politically feasible move. I don't know how it would work on with fossil fuels. I think you
Yeah.
run into a lot of the same issues.
because one of the
It's
one of
hard
the
to
things
use.
is that the nuclear storage. Also, are there big classes of them? Because it seems to be some of the ones that they use in France are really more
Yeah.
highly the superphysics and
Yeah, the ones in France are much more modern designs. Chernobyl was 1986, which is of course very close to the end of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
A lot of things were not as they should have been.
Okay. Thank you.
His point is very well taken about the long-term cost,
Yeah.
but what does that 8 years become with a closed fuel cycle?
Quite a bit longer. I don't think I've seen actual data on that, and I think it would depend on how
Is it
much of the
like-
fuel we were able to recycle.
150 years or 1,500 years?
Probably closer to 1,500 years. On the time scale, the politicians don't care about it anymore.
Right.
Check the batteries. Yeah. The actual battery. Actually, that was one of our talks said that they cut last year. Like heavier, they were efficient batteries. I think it's very hard. Every time I do a talk on my actual research, it's like, here are the climate change reasons we need batteries. But of course, we don't put lithium ion batteries in our phones.
How much of
So
what is the
that's always the more confusing argument. Yeah.
is other content?
Totally forgot about that uranium typo when I edited these.
Consuming part of that side.
Do we want to camera back up?
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're gonna get started again for the last section of our talk.
Okay, so we've talked about how energy has changed what humans are able to do, and we've talked about where we get it today, largely fossil fuels with decent contributions from nuclear and hydropower. Where are we going to get it in the future that will allow us to move away from fossil fuels? So we're going to briefly review the energy sources we've discussed so far. We're going to talk about what intermittency in energy production is and why it's important. We're going to discuss 3 different ways that we can guarantee everybody has energy when they need it in a renewable manner. And those are going to be transmission, moving electricity from one place to another, storage, and microgrids. So far, we've talked about hydropower. And hydropower is great because once you've built it, it's very inexpensive, but it is geographically limited. There's not that many places in the world where you can build a dam and let water flow down it. And by the best estimates, we've already dammed about half of those places. There's nuclear power. Nuclear power can produce a lot of energy, but it's very slow to build new plants. There's solar power, which we saw has really only started to come online within the last 10 years. But it's growing rapidly. The big challenge with solar power is it's intermittent. You can't produce it during the nighttime. And it's geographically determined. You're going to make a lot more of it in Arizona than in Massachusetts. We saw that wind power really started to pick up about 20 years ago. It is in very much the same basket as solar power. It's intermittent, it's not always windy, and it's more windy in some places than in others. So let's look at solar. We have here a map of the United States, and in places where it's more orange or red, you're getting more power from the sun. In places where it's yellow or kind of green, like us up here, you have shorter days for much of the year, you have less solar power available. So if you want to power your city on solar power and you live out in Arizona, that might be something you can do. It might be harder if you're up in northern Montana. What about wind? In wind, we can see these deep purple places have a lot of wind power available. There's quite a bit in the Midwest, but then we run into a similar problem. We could produce a lot of wind in, say, South Dakota, but how are we going to provide it to the places in California and the eastern seaboard where there are lots of people who live? In addition to geography, we have to consider that solar and wind energy are both intermittent energy sources. So here we have a chart of the wind supply, the solar supply, and the energy demand over the course of several weeks. And wind's very erratic. You might have a lot of wind for a few days, and then it will calm down, then it'll peak up and calm down. Solar is a little bit predictable, but no more constant. You have, during the daytime, a spike in sunlight that goes away at night. But you have days that are cloudy, and on those days, you just won't be able to produce much solar power. Human energy demand is very predictable and periodic. You have 5 days a week where people get up, they start using energy, they use more in the evenings, it tails off. And then after 5 of those days, you have 2 weekend days when they're using a little bit less energy. So the big question is, how can we make these 2 graphs match this graph? And what we do right now is, because renewable energy can't respond to the peaks in human demand, we use peaker plants. So we have renewable energy and some kind of baseload power plants. So often these are nuclear plants because they're expensive to turn off, that are producing energy full time. And then in the evening, when lots and lots of people need energy, we might say, hey, we need energy now. Could the natural gas plant turn on and start making that? And these are called peaker power plants. Sometimes, in places where there's a large amount of energy prices can actually go negative. because people won't want to have to turn all their windmills and completely shut them off. So they'll sell their energy for a negative price and effectively give it away. So how can we make sure that we can respond to these changes in energy needs throughout the day without making it uneconomical for power producers? So one solution is improved transmission. We've talked a lot about how we've enabled energy to be readily available for the entire country by running wires from power plants to people's homes. We could install more high voltage direct current wires to move energy from where it's very easy to produce it to where there's a lot of people demanding it. The difficulty with this is that the longer your wire is, the more of the energy is going to get lost on the trip. But people are trying this. Europe has quite a few power lines that run between different countries, courtesy of the EU. There are several countries in Asia who are also working to build what's called the Asian supergrid. So in Asia, you have Mongolia with the Gobi Desert, plenty of sunlight, only about 250,000 people. Could we take that energy and move it down to Hong Kong or Shanghai, where there's many people? So the goal is to connect these renewable sources in low population areas to high demand areas. And it's a little bit tricky to do because there's a lot of politics involved. You don't want to sell your country's energy to the country next door and then not have enough for your own population. So it's still to be seen if the Asian supergrid is going to become a reality. But that's one path we can take. The second path we can take is energy storage. You collect the extra light in the daytime, put it in a battery, and in the evening when you need a lot of it, but it's 4 p.m. and the sun's already set because it's December in Massachusetts, you take the energy out of that battery. And this is a particularly interesting solution if you're in an area that currently doesn't have grid access. So many places in Mongolia still have nomadic herds people. They're not connected to any kind of electric grid. So you'll sometimes see pictures where they have a solar panel and a little car battery that's storing their energy, and that's how they're getting electricity. The other solution for batteries is for power companies to buy them and install them to store energy when there's not a lot of demand for it, so they can sell it when energy is more expensive. And that helps them address this energy price going negative issue. So in the United States, each of these blue dots is a battery installation that goes with a power producer's facilities. The bigger the dot is, the more energy you can store. So you see we have a lot in Southern California and in this Midwest, Ohio, Pennsylvania region. That's largely for political reasons. Those parts of the countries have installed very renewable energy friendly policies. We have two little guys here in Massachusetts, one in Devens, about 40 minutes west of here, and one in Worcester, a little bit further. Those are both a special kind of battery called a redox flow battery. We also just got one in Shirley, Massachusetts. I point this out only because I work on flow batteries and think it's really cool that Massachusetts has several of them. A third solution, if you want something in addition to storing your energy or transmitting it, is to build a microgrid. So traditionally, the way we've gotten energy is we make it at the power plant sends it to your neighborhood, and from there it's split. So the local store might get one, the local farmer gets his energy, the schools and the courthouses get some, and some gets delivered to your home. And maybe you've installed a solar panel on your roof, so sometimes you can sell energy back to the electrical company. But in general, it's a pretty centralized one-way game, power plant to consumers. So increasingly, we are seeing this rapid growth in solar power and in wind power that can be sold back. What if instead of one big grid, we had a bunch of small local grids? So you can still get energy from the power plant, but you're not needing to do it as often because you're getting some from your solar panel, and maybe you're sending your excess over to the town shop. They have some stored in the battery that they've bought. They can sell it back to you or to the courthouse, and the energy can kind of be kept in a smaller area this way. And there's a couple advantages to this. One is that if a tree falls on the power line over here, you're all right. Your entire town is not going to be out of electricity. The other advantage is you're having to move the electricity less, so you have less transmission power losses. And a good example of this is actually the island of Alcatraz, somewhat surprisingly. Alcatraz is at this point a popular tourist destination. It's also an island, so it's not the easiest thing to run wires out there, although certainly something we can do. What they have done is they have installed 959 solar cells, 8 generators, and 480 batteries on the island, along with 2 diesel generators. And that provides all of the power that Alcatraz Island needs. So to kind of go back and look at the entire talk, the search for energy has been intimately entwined with human history. Having ready access to energy means we can live in more places, we can pursue more things, we can generally live like modern day people instead of like cavemen. And we're going to continue to need that. As the developing world develops, they'll demand more in energy, and we will need to find a way to supply it. And we will need to find a way to supply it that is not going to be destructive to ourselves or to our environment. Fortunately, we have renewable energy sources, including nuclear, hydro, solar, and wind, and they will continue to grow going forward. We will deal with the distributed and intermittent nature of these energy sources by building better transmission, better storage, and new innovative grid designs that will ultimately ensure everybody is going to have renewable, reliable access to electricity.
How about fusion? Is that in the future? Mineral,
So,
ritual?
sure. So the question is, could fusion become a useful form of energy? And fusion is a form of nuclear power in which you would take 2 atoms and put them together instead of breaking one apart. Right now, there is no way to fuse atoms where you are getting more energy out than you are having to put in to do it. And I don't know of a whole lot of progress that's being made in that, so I would be surprised if it ever becomes a significant source of electricity. Yes.
I think Princeton built a tomahawk, whatever it is, like a Taurus on fusion energy, and they were close to the break-even point.
Okay.
But they haven't achieved it. Los Alamos.
Okay, so there are people working on it. It does not sound like we are yet at the point where we can get more out than we are putting in. Yes.
Since you're involved in it, how close are we to actual affordable grid scale battery storage?
Well, people are buying them. I think, so the question is, how close are we to affordable grid scale energy storage? And the Department of Energy has a goal that an affordable energy storage technique can't cost more than $100 per kilowatt. We can make storage devices that are as low as about $200 per kilowatt hour, so we're definitely getting there. We have a little ways to go. Yeah.
Just a matter of scale, here about the one that was built in Australia
Yes.
by, what's his name?
Was this Elon Musk's battery?
Yeah, so what size is that compared to the one in
I don't. So the question is, Elon Musk recently built a large lithium-ion battery storage unit in Australia. I believe reading that it was one of the largest in the world. I don't think it was orders of magnitude bigger than these, but I would have to check the news reporting on that.
besides wind and solar, there probably are some other areas where there's a large potential supply of electricity
Yes.
if the technical problems of getting it economically can be overcome.
Yes.
One I heard about was slower currents than can currently be used in hydropower. So, do you know of any of those that look particularly promising?
So, to make sure I understand your question, you want to know if there are other forms of,
Wind is one source.
yes.
Hydropower is at a certain current speed is another source. Solar is a possible source. You could probably calculate on a global scale how much energy is available from those sources, and with the right
Yes.
technology, you can recover you know,
Yes.
viable amounts. What other sources than those three is technology close to being viable at, where there's a significant potential supply of power?
Sure. So the question is, other than hydro, solar, and wind power, what other forms of renewable energy are getting close to the point where they'd be technologically feasible and readily available?
And have a large enough supply to have a global impact.
Yes. So one that we did not talk about is biofuels, which, much like fossil fuels, you're burning something, so you are producing carbon dioxide, but you're producing often ethanol that we grew from corn. So the carbon dioxide came out of the atmosphere, was used to make the corn plant, and now you're just putting it back. So on the net, you are theoretically not putting any carbon dioxide in. That is a fairly well-developed technology. It's not actually at the point where zero carbon dioxide is released, but we can imagine it getting there. There's a variety of variations on hydropower, probably not enough to supply a major chunk of the world's electricity, but you can collect hydropower from running streams or from tidewater that in certain locations can be an efficient method of collecting energy.
Just mentioned tide water, why are they really not getting more in cost? People try to really design type of design for the last 50, 60 years. Did they improve a lot?
So by they, you mean methods for generating tide power?
Yeah, using tide power. Hydro.
Sure. So I think tide power has a couple of difficulties it has to overcome. One is that it's not really evenly distributed. There are places in the world where you have much more of it than others. The other is that people really are not big fans of you building energy collection facilities in their harbors. They like to use those to get boats in and out. People who live on the harbors don't want to see your tide power collection station there. And that creates a little bit of political pressure on it.
So it's not the cost issue?
So there are places in the world where it would be economical. There are quite a few places where there's just not enough tide power in a small enough area for it to be cheap enough.
Because there was some design where they are not really at the shore, a little bit kind of offshore kind of things where they use the ocean current to do that, right?
Yes. Those do exist. I don't see them becoming a major source of our power, but there are parts of the world where they will continue to be effective. Yeah.
We have to harness electricity or power from, or is energy from lightning?
So the question is, can we harness energy or electricity from lightning? So I guess I have two answers to this. One is probably not on a large scale because lightning is like the ultimately intermittent source, right? When it hits, you will have a lot of energy, but it will hit very infrequently. In a more kind of, it's cool scientifically, even if it's never going to be practical answer, that's effectively what lightning rods do, right? They take the energy from lightning and convert it as electricity in a metal. We just don't collect that for our own use.
Let's give Emily another round of applause. Please give your suggestions for future topics that you may have. Thanks, everyone.